So in the previous video in the series, I did a brief history on the production of Begotten by Edmund Marriage, as well as a basic plot synopsis. Clearly I was holding back a lot of my own interpretations of the film and only threw a few out just to get the ideas firing in the brain since, yeah, this movie is very vague. However, there is quite a lot of stuff convulsing on the bones of this movie. I think the first reaction by non-artsy critics is that Begotten is a series of random images thrown together in a loose format, and that none of the shit happening on screen actually has any meaning, and that's just so damn far from the truth, man. All art has a meaning, or as Brian Warner once said, art is a question mark. Begotten is certainly questionable. I mean, it's not exactly a movie you can just have a casual conversation about. I mean, trying to just say to your boss, the scene where God shits himself is clearly a metaphor for X and clearly not just a man shitting, is a little distressing. To most people. Thankfully. My first run of the movie, I went in with no experience to it and didn't even read the Wikipedia synopsis, thank God, because we all know how I think the person that wrote it must have been stoned, stupid, or a combination of both. I had a loose idea that there was some sort of theme in the film just by the name alone, as I knew it was a biblical term going in, so my mind defaulted to trying to find Christian themes in the film. You know, it's actually really interesting because my boy Rochester, the absolute unit, he says a really good point in his analysis of the film where he theorizes that how and where you were raised is going to have a major impact on how you personally form your own interpretations of the film, and he's totally correct. I'm an American raised in a family that had strong Native American, Christian, and Baptist philosophies, as well as someone who was an eclectic pagan, and still holds satanic and nihilistic philosophies to heart, but has Christian views, but doesn't agree with organized religion, but I'm not an agnostic. You know, needless to say, I'm an absolute clusterfuck in terms of worldviews, but I think that's what kind of gives me an edge in terms of finding deeper meaning in Begotten as opposed to some shithead zoomer who thinks that spirituality is just ghost-related videos by that shitheel named Chills. Like I've been hinting at in the synopsis video, there are so many small things injected in this film that make it fascinating to break down, and I think much like Silent Hill 2, each person walks away from this movie with a different opinion and interpretation. There may be some universal overlap in opinions, yeah, but I think that what makes a movie like this great is that your experiences and worldview can shape this film into whatever you want it to be, and you're likely not going to be wrong to an extent. It's not like in Silent Hill 2, where you can try to spin narratives like, oh, James is just dreaming this all, or the side characters aren't really in the town and James made them up. No, that doesn't work in a story like that because there's too many factors in the established world that prevent fringe or conflicting information to take over the accepted facts. Begotten is almost so vague, especially because of the lack of dialogue, that there's almost a certainly infinite amount of interpretations, but I've narrowed a few of the themes down that I came across from my own experiences and worldviews. I'm willing to entertain the idea that I look too hard into some things, but I tried to stick with the ideas the average American viewer could come to, and themes that tend to crop up in discussion of the film. The relationship between nature and humankind, allegories to Christian mythology, nihilism in nature, cycles of life and death. I'm sure I'm not the first person to come up with some of these themes for sure, as this movie has been out for decades, but I try my hardest to form my own opinions based on gut instinct, with as little sway from other opinions as possible. I'm going to be briefly going through each scene in the film in order and give my best interpretation as possible to fit with all of the themes listed above. I spent quite some time looking for all the connections, mind you, over multiple viewings of the film, like about a dozen, and it's likely I missed something, but trust me, I'm okay with missing things. I encourage other people to share their thoughts on the film in the comments below, as I think that is what makes art so engaging to me and many others. So before I get started as well, please note I'll be using the same names and shorthands I used in the first video, so when I say something like the priests, I'm referring to the first nomads that are shown in the film, or the farmers being the nomads at the end. I'll also point out one more time, I do not think the world of Begotten is supposed to be Earth as it is today, but rather a parallel to our own planet and cultures. I look at media using my in the vacuum style of analysis, meaning the world the film takes place in is just what I'm looking at, and I try my best to just use the film as the source of information and not resort to, supplemental information like director interviews or actor input. I'll allow the use of some stuff like the names for characters from the credits and the DVD pamphlet that contains the scene names, as this gives a hell of a lot of insight into the film's subtext, and because of the intro passage, it's clear to me that this is metatextual information and meant to be relevant to the film and the message. Now, Let's get started because trust me, I want to get into this and tie it all together to the final video in the series, and this whole analysis takes away from time that I need to get my precious pets in RuneScape, okay? The first scene in the film is the text that I quoted in the synopsis. To me, this is addressing the audience and directly addressing people like marriage, filmmakers, journalists, artists. This is our first hint that the film deals with the idea of time and its passage, pointing out subtly that works like this film or magazines, music, all the names behind all that work will die and likely be forgotten in the future, and their words and meanings will be frozen in this kind of in vitro state, but have no meaning in the present in which they are discovered. You could compare this to the modern and cringe-inducing phrase, "that didn't age well," because, well, yeah, nothing written or made will ever age well. It's a relic of the time it was made, just like the film. This is also a concept that can break some people's mind in that, yeah, you can't technically live in the present no matter how hard you try to, because almost every second of our waking day is spent in retrospect or preparation of the future. So, yeah, it's a really solid bit of brain tickling to get the audience into like this right state of mind to watch the movie. The second couplet of what I guess we'll call this bit of poetry states that here lives the incantation of matter, a language of forever. I interpret this personally as matter being another phrasing for sentience, and for sentience to be a metaphor for the concept of the present. Essentially, life is the present, our creations are the past, and our death is the future in an endless cycle of nature's history. We then cut to a black screen and hear an overture of the coming of a storm, which could possibly be a foreshadowing to storms being used in the film to show danger or severe changes in the way the world is progressing. This storm overture could also likely be a nod to the eerie overture used in the film Space Odyssey, but I might be reaching for straws or just really love that movie. I mean, that's very likely. The next couplet is interesting because it does get called back to at the end of the film, which I'll bring up later. It also gives a subtle hint that life in this film is convulsive and quite sporadic in its movement when we look at most of the characters in the side cast. This might also be a stretch, but I find the glowing of the text here is more noticeable than the previous shot, possibly linking to the mention of the word fire in the couplet. Next, we get a highly debated shot amongst some viewers, but I find this shot to be of God's eye, based on the close-up of the mask in a bit, and a foreshadow into the upcoming scenes. If we scrub this footage back and forth at a higher frame rate, you can also make out that this is God's eye moving from left to the middle and presumably blinking. What does it mean? I think that it's to mainly disorient and get the audience to start asking questions based on the vagueness of what they're looking at. Finally, we get to the title of the film, Begotten, which I've been holding off on saying the meaning of until now. Begotten basically means to be created and raised or brought into life, and is fairly similar to the term sire or sired, relating heavily to fathering and raising a child from a male perspective. Begotten is also the past tense of the word beget, which is, like I said, basically a synonym for the word sire or sired. Now we can also look at this from the biblical term, which most have probably heard of at some point, as truthfully I've never heard the word begotten used in any other context before I saw this film. Only begotten Son and immortal Word of God, who for our salvation didst will be incarnate of the holy Theotokos and ever Virgin Mary, who without change didst come man and was crucified, who art one of the Holy Trinity glorified with the Father and the Holy Spirit. O Christ our God, trampling down death by death, save us. For those unfamiliar, this is an old Christian hymn of Orthodox origin, essentially describing Jesus' life and rebirth, and his place in the Holy Trinity as the literal Son of God. Like I said, the expression begotten son is the only time I've ever heard this term used, as the phrase sired is much more common. Well, as common as ancient words can get, you fucking hipster. Anyways, point is, this is our first hint at a possible connection to Christian mythology referenced in the film, and was the first thing I noticed on just the title alone before I watched it. The next shot is of a lake and is described in the table of contents as the Black Lake. This is likely an establishing shot, but water comes up a lot in this film. Not come. Well, that does come up, but the stillness of the water could likely represent the state of life before everything starts, as opposed to the storm and the flooding at the end of the film. My money is more leaning on the establishing shot though, but the second option is still likely on the table. Another thing to note is the bird passing over might be a metaphor for ascension, relating to God's death, but I think I might be looking too deep there, and I can't really build much more off of that. It could likely just be part of the establishing shot to show that this film takes place in the wild. Now for the house shot. If we take this at face value, this is likely a nod to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre Sawyer house, which Marriage claims was an influence on Begotten, and get ready for this, remember in my synopsis when I was referring to things such as the house or the forest? I view the house as a metaphor for a heaven or astral realm.
I'm playing Sega Forever in the astral realm.
Yeah, I know that's some pretty complex shit, but think about it. This is the only structure in the film resembling habitation that we see. The only two characters that interact with this environment are both God and Mother Earth as well. Despite what happens here, this is actually the safest place in the film. It provides shelter from the outside as well, and it's just my interpretation that this is not only some sort of heaven where God dwells at times, but a place where God feels safe enough to birth Mother Earth into existence. It makes sense to me if I was a weird god deity thing to birth my offspring in my domain, rather than the woods. What, you mean you don't think about that? Our next shot is actually a very clever one. We can see God in the right-hand corner of the screen, but on first viewing you're likely not going to see him until your eyes are pointed towards his movement near the doorframe. Not gonna lie, this is a really badass way of shaking up a shot's focal point for those wanting to take notes on their own, because I didn't actually notice this on my first viewing. The next shot is a cool crossfade into God, giving him an almost ethereal appearance, like he's phasing into the wheelchair. I feel this is also a subtle way of making God feel divine, or maybe kinda ghostly, which might also tie into the idea of the Holy Spirit. The infamous shot of God in the corner is pretty multifaceted, so here we go. The bloody spit and gagging noises are a foreshadow to Earthchild's eventual, talent. God is also in a wheelchair, which implies to me a subtle nod to when women are in labor and need assistance moving. Speaking of labor, we can see that God's blood splatter is centered on his groin, and this might be a reference to childbirth since, where else do babies come from? A fucking bird in the sky? What are you, 5? The blood splatters around the corner might be for shock value, but if we take this movie's themes of cyclical patterns into account, this may not be the first time this has happened, and this is simply a new god deity continuing the process of life and death. Now for the mouth shot, this is likely a nod to how Earthchild eventually regurgitates things, and the reason I say this is likely a mouth is the sides of the mask look way too square as opposed to the angular and rounded eye slits of the mask. The eye-opening shot could also be a representation of fear, or just a cool camera trick, I'm not really sure which. It's also worth noticing at this point that the sound you've been hearing that's underscored in this first scene is actually a clock. My first time watching this, I thought it was gushing blood, but then I realized it was too rhythmic, and you may have noticed by now there's a large clock in the room as well to the left of God. It's important because when we see the window shot of it, the camera makes sure that the clock is in frame for quite some time before the next eye fade. What do I think the clock means? I feel that the clock is a representation of time itself relating to God's existence, or to make it easier, God is time and time is God, if you catch my drift. The circular design of the clock also could possibly be a notion to a circular pattern, or this is all destined to happen again, basically. Now for God's death. This is more than likely a nod to the Nietzsche quote, "God is dead, we killed him." Funny enough, this is actually a shorthand of a passage in The Gay Science by Nietzsche, and the full quote relates more to the upcoming scene than you'd think, so I'll read it here. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Now, I'm sure someone has etched this shorthand of this quote into their high school desk a million times but not really thought about what the quote actually can mean, but in the film, I view it as a metaphor for not only the straight razor God uses, but also to the foreshadowing of the brutality that Earthchild will receive that kills a would-be god. The actual quote also, to me, relates more to humans overcoming the need for religion and killing God by science, reason, and human cruelty. Also, yes, I'm of the impression that Child of Earth was destined to be the new god over time, so I'll spoil that now. Back to what you're here for, though, and I believe the convulsing and sporadic movements of God also relate back to the poem from the start, as well as replicating the contractions and pain of childbirth. We could also view the tossing of God's flesh as symbolic of childbirth, or even the expulsion of the placenta. Hell, even the act of God cutting his stomach could be a metaphor for a C-section, but I think you get the idea I have in mind here. This scene likely represents human labor and childbirth, but all wrong and yucky. If we look at this in a biblical standpoint, we can glance at John 1:14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Fuck, last time you got symbolic history with Seth, now you're getting bad Bible study with Seth. Anyways, this roughly translates to me and many others as Jesus was a man of God's creation who lived among us. This makes sense if we look at Mother Earth as a stand-in for the Virgin Mary and Earth Child as Jesus. The word in Christianity refers to the Word of God, and the made flesh refers to Jesus, but we could spin that literally in this scene as God's flesh giving rise to new life in the form of Mother Earth. It could also be a callback to Ichor of Greek mythology, being the blood of the gods and having unique powers of creation and destruction. Like I said, this movie is much deeper than it looks on the surface, or I just am really bored and have nothing better to do with my free time. Like, look at a man's poo. Jokes aside, I feel the scene does have some deeper context. Firstly, notice that on the panning shot of God's corpse, that the heartbeat sound has stopped playing, signifying total death. Secondly, I feel that the poo isn't just there to be gross, but also could relate to childbirth, as in either the placenta's expulsion or pushing out a baby from the birth canal. Thirdly, just as the music kicks in before Mother Earth's appearance, we can also hear the clock stop, possibly showing that God's time is totally finished and the cycle must now repeat anew. Or the production equipment couldn't actually have that many sound channels. I like the former over the latter because it makes me feel smarter. Now we get into the birth scene. Not only do I love the theme that plays here because it tickles all the parts of me that are worth tickling, it's actually evocative to me of curiosity and calmness. There's also this underlying drum track that sort of sounds like a heartbeat and adds this upbeat and bright tone to the track. Nice touch from the sound team here. Everyone who watches this film with their middle school brain on tends to find it weird that Mother Earth gropes her breasts in this scene, but I think this could be seen as her feeding the new and budding world around her, which relates to my observations further on, so trust me on that. We can see some interesting visual parallels between Mother Earth and God here, with one thing I noticed being that her face mask is black to God's white one. This may be a stretch, but God's robes at the lower half are stained with blood or dark, similar to Mother Earth's skirt, and both of them wear a white top. Both also appear to be barefoot and also have darker hair that's somewhat longer. It's not fair for me to judge hair length because my hair is the definition of obscenely long, so we'll just say long for the normal person. One thing I find interesting is that Mother Earth is shown in the film mainly looking to the sky, like she does immediately after her birth. I view this as two things. One, she's likely looking up in curiosity and wonder at the new world around her, or she could be literally looking up to the sky as a link to God's essence or spirit. I think both are valid if you consider that the only shots of the film's sky are mainly for time transitions, so if we took the idea that God is time and time is God, this kind of makes sense. Also, the sky, sun, and moon have had significant importance to almost all cultures across the planet since the dawn of our own time. It's also worth pointing out that Mother Earth, like as in her namesake, is an ancient concept that can be tied with either the terms Mother Nature or Mother Earth. It's funny that even now, we still use the term Mother Nature in 2024. That's how prevalent and ingrained into human culture globally the concept of our planet being a literal mother deity actually is. In Begotten, I feel it's 100% a safe assumption to view Mother Earth as being linked to the survival of the planet as well, because of the ending of the film. So to me, and many others, Mother Earth is a physical manifestation of nature and balance, birthed from the remains and sacrifice of God. Next, we'll look at what I call the Immaculate Conception scene. I think this scene illustrates something kind of deep in that we as a species are fundamentally driven in nature to reproduce and survive out of instinct. If you took out all the complex bullshit of day-to-day life, what would you be left with? Eat, kill, mate, repeat, because we create virtually all of the other social constructs to justify these basic instincts in some capacity. There's a reason once we hit puberty, humans start to change, because the survival phase of our life is over, and now we can theoretically reproduce and fight others to ensure our offspring survive. These are just instincts plastered into our DNA and fundamentally what make up the animal that we actually are, despite how modern day idiots want to eschew the idea that we are an animal and our social politics are pointless in real nature. Anyways, Mother Earth's head is also in the shot with the clock from earlier, which also could mean that she's aware her time is limited and the need to act is now, so she inseminates herself to keep time and nature to stay in balance once more. It's also worth noting that this scene could be taken as a literal interpretation of the Christian belief in Immaculate Conception. If you're unsure of what that means, it's that the Holy Spirit, the ethereal form of God in the Christian sense, impregnated the Mother Mary through non-sexual means, who would later birth Jesus Christ through what's known as the virgin birth. Still with me so far? Good. It only gets more and more deeper from here, so get ready. I've only covered like 8 minutes of the movie so far. Now we have God's funeral scene. This one, I'm not really 100% sure on, even after all this time. I think the coffin moving implies that this has happened many times before. You can also notice that in one shot, the coffin flops open, and then dissipates into the next shot to the right. I'm not sure if this is a technical issue, or just something added to make the audience notice the movement, like with the shot in the doorframe earlier in the film. The reason I think this is meant to convey the cycle of God being born and dying is because of the final shot of the sequence we can see very briefly Mother Earth is standing by the final coffin shown. See, this is the magic of being able to break things down with video editing software that people wouldn't have had access to when this film came out. I'm just that damn special. Anyways, the next scene is really cool stylistically, and we can see that Mother Earth's top has changed to a black color, signifying mourning or loss as she rubs her stomach. Like I said before, I think this may also be a cue to the audience and to the character that her new job is to safely birth and raise the new future God to keep the cycle of life going. You could also interpret this whole segment as the realistic cycle of life. Conception, life, and death. I feel the water shot is mainly a stylistic shot, not really containing much subtext that I could try and unbury, but I feel the next scene of Mother Earth is significant. I feel the branches in the background could be a foreshadowing to the assault scene that comes later on in the film, and the vignette effect could also be subconsciously implying the impending danger. I might be looking too deep into that, but that's just how I feel. We get a still frame of inside Mother Earth's uterus, and the sound of rumbling water, which I view as a subtle bit of foreshadowing to Earthchild's regurgitation, as this same sound effect is used when that's happening. I've slowed down and scrubbed through the frames following this, and it's either supposed to be the inside of a womb, Harry Kim's favorite place, or it's just some random shit that Marriage filmed and rubbed against the camera. Eventually, yeah, there's a shot of some glowing sperm cells, which you should really get checked out if that happens, and 2 glowing shots of a developing embryo. More random frames of possibly the womb, and we move on to our first time passage shot of what I presume is a sunrise. I've said in the synopsis video that I view shots of the sky as a time passage, but also that the time lapse also represents the state of the world. In this case, the sun is rising as new life is created in the form of Child of Earth, flesh on bone, the future God. The scene of Earthchild's reveal is actually a really neat and stylistic shot, by the way, because he comes in slowly from the right against the negative space created by the contrast, so it draws your eyes to focus on the only source of light on screen. Once again, this is some basic but well put together composition. We can also hear that heartbeat effect is rapid after the implied birth scene, which is another neat auditory trick because childbirth isn't exactly a pleasant or easy task. Our species kind of sucks at that.
Let it out. Let it out.
Now, the scene of Mother Earth walking is actually another one of my favorite scenes in the film because it really stuck out to me in my first viewing. I think this is a great scene for illustrating that Mother Earth moves around the world creating life or has a connection to the plants around. There's also a very deliberate usage of leaves in this shot composition, which I think is meant to convey this, as well as foreshadow the ending of the film when life starts to grow again. Notice how once Mother Earth begins to walk away from Earthchild, this is the moment he starts to live, also implying that both of them have a connection to the planet's life. When I first watched this, my gut instinct told me that this scene is also meant to convey the uncaring reality of nature, as Mother Earth has to leave Earthchild behind to do her part and he has to fend for himself. You could also view this as Mother Earth as more like a major deity, and Earthchild would be a demigod who ascends to godhood by the end of his role. I hope that makes some sense. For the scene of Earthchild raising his head and gasping, I view this as similar to the Book of Genesis, how God created life into the first humans, as right after this, we get introduced to what I call the priest nomads. This might also be a nod to Eraserhead, when the baby is sick and makes a horrible noise, since Marriage was actually inspired by this film, or I just have Eraserhead on the mind, which isn't a bad thing, all things considered. It's a great movie. Watch it when you think you want to have children.
Oh, you are sick.
Now, the arrival of the priest is a badass shot with a ton of subtext, at least to me, and I hope I'm right. This might be a callback to the opening shot's text about life being flesh on bone, convulsing above the ground, but taken literally. I'm also going to preface, I don't think that it matters exactly what the first humans are or where they came from in the context of the film, because as I've said, I view everything in this film taking place within a new cycle of life, so it's best to look at it in this way, in my opinion. On my first viewing of the film, by the way, the first instinct I had of the shot was a parallel to the wise men at Jesus' birth, traveling to bring gifts to the infant. We can even see that there's a slight pause after the first priest's appearance, and then 3 are shown in shot after him. It even appears that one of these nomads are holding a censer, which is used to burn incense, which, yeah, frankincense was one of the 3 gifts brought to baby Jesus. After the encircling shot and we see an image of Earthchild, he looks horrific and helpless, which is strange because we never see him portrayed like this in the film after this. He's always shown after this being more human-like, but still twitching, which, yeah, if you also couldn't guess this by now, I think his twitching is a parallel to God's movements and the text from the start of the film. I also really like the introduction of the priest because this is the first time in the movie we see other types of humans, and they're portrayed as either curious or uncertain, and it builds suspense for the viewer the first time they watch it. Once again, we see the sun is rising, which is meant to also mean that humanity is doing the right thing and the course of life is in balance and working as intended. The scenes of Earthchild being moved around may seem boring, but there's at least one cool shot in here that I really like, and it's this one of the priest traveling near the water and the camera's picking up the reflection. This is just fucking cool, man. Bravo to whoever thought of this angle, as it makes this whole thing feel ethereal and dreamlike. It must have been a neat concept for a shot because it also shows up again, except in reverse, towards the end of the film with the farmer nomads. Like I said, this is a movie about cycles and events mirroring, and not just random images thrown together willy-nilly. Maybe I'm also looking at it too deep, but I also view the way that Earthchild's arms are splayed out as meant to evoke feelings of the crucifixion of Christ. This could be a stretch because, let's face it, our upper body just kind of looks like a crucifix no matter what, but I feel this might have been a deliberate choice. Also, I don't view the priest nomads as being hostile and view them as being curious. If they wanted to kill Earthchild, they could have done it the moment they ran across him. If I had to guess what they could likely represent in the film, they might represent humanity's early curiosity to learn and discover. You could also kind of liken them to the apes in Space Odyssey and Earthchild as the monolith, giving them knowledge and teaching them about how to keep the planet alive. I also view the outfits that they wear to evoke God's robes from the start of the film. Whether or not they were some sort of followers of the old god and are inducting Earthchild to be the new one, well, I'm split down the middle, but I don't think that either this or the above theory is wrong, or mutually exclusive to the other. I still sort of view them as early humans learning and being curious, and they eventually revere Earthchild as the new god. Either way, let's move on to the spitting scene. From the body language, it appears that this shocks the priests, and they likely didn't know Earthchild could do this. No joke, if you're still on the side of these guys being hostile, look at the way the priest on the left of this shot leans down. He seems inquisitive and like he wants to help in some way. Also, look at the way the priest on the right eventually holds and cradles the object in Earthchild's mouth. He doesn't appear destructive or cruel to me, and the whole scene gives me the vibe that these guys are actually more or less midwives, helping Earthchild birth the things that he's spitting out. Pay attention to the stuff coming out of his mouth too. It's very similar to the stuff God was carving and tossing out of him in the beginning scene, which is more evidence towards the idea that Earthchild is destined to be the new god. Also, if we consider this makes sense why there was blood on God's mask, because the primary delivery of this substance is from the mouth and likely builds up from the inside. What do I think this stuff actually is, though? Well, if we look at the end of the film, the farmers are planting flesh to help the planet sustain itself. The flesh the god character in Earthchild spit out is likely supposed to be a metaphor for seeds, or literally the seeds of life. Could this substance be what created all the other human characters? I kind of lean on that idea, honestly. If we look at the title of the film, once again, Begotten, to be raised or fathered, this kind of makes sense that these priest nomads are learning how to raise and father life, literally. If it helps my idea make sense, I'll narrow it down to a simple concept. Mother Nature creates the planet's atmosphere and flora, Earthchild creates and maintains the human life forms, the humans that exist help create and sustain the planet, the cycle continues. The farmers at the end simply help life grow from the flesh of the dead, like fertilizer and nutrients, and this isn't as crazy as you think. Death and decay is a huge part of what keeps the real-life plants and animals in a constant state of growth from the dispersion of nutrients into the soil that helps various plants, fungi, and other animals. Animal feces spread seeds from berries and fruit. Bones in their marrow break down into minerals that help support plant life. Ever wonder why morel mushrooms absolutely thrive in an area full of high leaf litter and decay? Facts of life with Seth aside, notice how the priest even wiped the blood from Earthchild's mouth? That's just cute, man. That's the most wholesome moment in the whole movie. Once again, back to the idea that these nomads are reminiscent of midwives. Notice how as they all group together, they seem to rhythmically push and assist in delivering the fleshy seeds. This could be a foreshadowing to the stick nomads as well. We also see the priest dress Earthchild once again, solidifying the idea that he's meant to evoke the old god. You can also see this as a foreshadow to the scene where the farmers stuff him into a sack based on the struggle. Why do they dress him? I mean, shit, dude, they gotta give this guy some rockin' threads to match their own. Nah, in all reality, they likely dress him to show respect and acceptance. Also, notice how much like God from the start of the film, Earthchild can't walk and is being assisted by his umbilical cord for support. God, as far as we know, can't walk and is being assisted by his wheelchair or used it as his own method of self-reliance. The hoisting of Earthchild up the cliff could be a metaphor for ascension into godhood, and then tossing the umbilical cord could be seen as the priest being the new support for him, as they plan on taking him into their company and learning from him. What does the pot and fire mean then? Well, the fire I think is meant to be evocative of the flame of life, or the soul, as Earthchild is spitting out the seeds of future life. The pot? This is a bit tricky for me. We don't see any of the priests put anything into it when they light the fire, and the way they pick it up so easily makes me think it's empty. It could be an early foreshadow to the pots being moved around by the farmers full of decayed flesh, and a reverse idea of that, as this appears to be the only vessel these nomads could use to put flesh seeds into. I love this scene. These guys look like they're having a time out there. Notice their hoods seem to have eye slits as well, similar to the mask God wears. This could give credence to the idea that they either worshipped or learned from the previous god and are emulating his style. Let's move on to the spit scene next, as I think it's a pretty interesting moment. I've seen a few people put forward the idea that this scene is meant to convey that the priest set Earthchild on fire. I don't really think that's what it means because of the smoke and fire. Like I said a moment ago, if they wanted to just light him on fire, they could have done it minute one. I think that the smoke is merely there for aesthetics and to show the world is evolving. The main thing about this scene is the spit bubble in Earthchild's mouth. I think this is likely to remind people that he's theoretically a newborn and also getting rid of excess fluids. You know, it's why you smack babies after they're born. Or that's what I was meant to believe. This scene is also pretty confusing, so I'll do my best to explain what I think it's meant to show. One of the priests helps burst the bubble so that Earthchild can breathe. The main leader priest comes in with his staff in the middle and begins to help push the seeds out. The priest on the right puts his hand down Earthchild's throat to help him vomit out flesh seeds. You could also see this as a direct metaphor for reaching out and taking knowledge, I suppose? What does all the water mean? I think this is what gives the nomads the idea of farming and agriculture to help create new life, or eventually create the farmer nomads. What does the fire shot mean? It's kind of a stretch, but it might be that the priests added life to the seeds by the way of fire? Like I said, I don't know, this scene is rather confusing to me. The sun is also shown to be setting now, which I view as not only a passage of time, but that the world is in a worsening or changing state. I also don't view this scene as the priests tossing Earthchild into the fire below, because it seems to me that they are just embracing him into their, culture. You could compare this scene to Jesus spreading his word and gaining followers if you want to compare it to that. I assume that the scene we see of the rocks and smoke is later into the future. We also get to see some trees and hear wildlife, so it's possible that a considerable amount of time has passed since the previous shot, since most of what we've seen around the priest is barren and dry. This is the point where I feel Earthchild has died a natural death, and these one-off nomads I call the mourners are about to immolate his corpse out of respect and return him to the nature that birthed him, Mother Earth. This is why we get a flash shot of her by the water and the sun begins to rise anew as we start a new cycle of life, just like the start of the film. The next time we see Earthchild, notice he's wearing what looks like new robes, he's much more visibly clean, and he's actually somewhat able to support himself. His overall demeanor is much calmer as well, and let's take note of the location he's in. I've mentioned earlier on in this video how I viewed the house as a safe location or similar to a heavenly area. In my mind, the house is the centermost area of the film's world, and the forest that we see that spreads outwards from it is towards the wasteland where we see all the other human nomad characters. To me, as long as this forest exists and the house still stands, this is how the reincarnation cycle can truly stay afloat, and what allows Earthchild and Mother Nature to regenerate based on the actions of the nomads outside in the ever-shrinking wastes. You could look at it like our real world, where we have seed reserves for certain plants and GMOs in place to keep things somewhat leveled out to where we gain net positives in plant growth, or animal conservation to keep endangered species from dying out. All of this is based off of human intervention and a want to preserve and protect, which is something unique to our species. So what do I ultimately think this scene of Mother Earth and Earthchild reuniting means in terms of the film's story? I think this is meant to convey that the two are linked together, and each time one dies, so long as the nomads keep balance, they'll return anew until their tasks are completed and a new god has been raised. Once again, begotten, to raise or father a child. The umbilical cord is meant to also show this link literally for the audience to piece together. By the way, I fucking love the main theme of this film, man, and this scene is so good. It's eerie, calming, well scored, and well framed. Notice how Earthchild now seems to have more control of his movements the closer he is to his mother, and he's no longer just gagging up seeds because of the cord and connection. At this point in the film, the world is at the most calm and in balance, hence the music, like with Mother Earth's birth scene. Pretty fucking clever, man. This is why you can't just dismiss shit like this film as having no meaning. Now, this next shot of the trees without leaves, I view this as a metaphor for the arrival of the stick nomads. Notice how the camera was panning left, and once we see our first ghostly image of a stick nomad, the music turns into an ominous dirge, and the camera then rapidly begins to shift to the right. What I think the stick nomads represent is the rape of nature or human cruelty. I think that even with very little care or observation for the film, this is portrayed fairly well, and it's likely one of the film's most basic and simple connections a viewer can make. Their staffs are also created from what looks like bones or branches, giving more implications that these nomads have taken and warped the planet to their own advantage, either by conquest or lust. Due to the upcoming scene, I think the sticks are also meant to be a subtle bit of phallic imagery. We also get a shot of the sun being blocked out by a cloud, meaning that the arrival of these nomads is an omen of death and loss, and to subtly warn the audience by another visual cue that these guys are nothing but trouble, hinted at with the thunder. Oh, and can I just say I love the cinematography for this bit. The low-angle shot of the stick nomad's leg implies dominance and shows that they have a height and sight advantage over the two below. The same goes for the shot of the two stick nomads standing together observing. If we look at their design, notice how their leader on the left also wears a mask similar to the one that God wears at the start of the film, but warped and wider. Does it mean that this nomad was a fallen god? I don't think so. Just likely it's a callback meant to evoke mockery and a disregard of nature? Maybe? It's also likely that these nomads have their legs showing in waist garments meant to evoke phallic imagery, or they have some serious hangdong. Either way, this shot is just awesome, and like I said in my first video, it really stands the animal part of your brain on edge. You know this is danger, based on thousands of years of evolution. It's that good. I'm not going to go into much detail here, both for YouTube's sake and because I think this part of the film is pretty obvious contextually. The poking of the staff at Mother Earth is a pretty overt metaphor for humans tainting the planet with cruelty or destruction. Why does she stand still, you might also wonder? I think because both Mother Earth and Earthchild are more or less concepts and aspects of nature, given form, they can't really interact with the humans. This is much like how in real life something like wind, water, or fire is something that just happens theoretically out of our control, but we can control through indirect means like putting out forest fires caused by lightning strikes, damming water flow, or using wind to generate power. I also don't think that Mother Earth can move here because of the near fatal blow to Earthchild, as the two are connected at this point and his spasm is causing her to be immobilized. The scene of the stick nomads poking and groping at Earthchild is also meant to be a mirroring of the scene where the priests were taking the seeds from him and where they clothed him, as far as I can tell. I think the reason they also move on from him to Mother Earth is because the stick nomads realize they can't force him to give them the seeds of life, so they'll just take their lust and frustrations out on her instead. I do really like the shot of the sun and the striking blow. It's dramatic, eerie, and very powerful. We can even hear the sounds of birds in panic at the cut to Earthchild as the planet starts to feel the repercussions of this act. I don't really think I need to go into detail for this scene, man. Pretty much anyone can get the gist of it. There is one thing, though, I can say that I alluded to in my previous video. Notice how the scene is shifted from the wasteland area on top of some rocks to now a big pile of cut trees? This is another reason I call these guys the stick nomads, because they fashion their weapons from the very gift of nature and in turn ravage the planet like careless clear-cutting is done in the real world. I'm an Oregonian, man, so this scene really hits home to me. You can't just cut down our precious trees, okay? We're like the Lorax state.
I speak for the trees! Let them grow!
While I obviously won't show the graphic shit going on here, there is some stuff in this scene that I think is quite interesting when you go through it slowly. We see a flash shot of two figures that I've dubbed the mummies. I'm not sure if these two are meant to be Earthchild and Mother Earth as their spiritual connection shattering, or if they were just meant to be two random kills that the stick nomads have tallied up to show they've done something like this before in the past. We get a very quick shot of Earthchild spitting up the seeds from earlier with the priests. I'm not sure if this was meant to just freak out the viewer at the sudden image of a face like with the mummies, or it was meant to remind the viewer of the past kind and caring nature of the priest nomads. I kinda lean on freaky imagery really, as this is so quick there's very little time to process it, unlike the mummies. There's also a shot of some hands in the timber pile, which I think is meant to show that on top of the damage to the flora, the stick nomads have also killed other humans in their conquest. Like I said, these guys likely represent human depravity, made obvious by their on-screen actions. The clouds taking over in the oncoming storm also implies to me that this is the world going out of balance or creating some sort of apocalyptic state at this act of desecration. Once the camera cuts to the clouds parting, I feel this shows a passage of time has occurred and that even though Mother Earth has been killed, the planet still holds on through human preservation, hence the reason grass is in frame of the shot and we hear a track similar to the main theme of the film. I feel this is further evidenced by the caterpillar moving and the birds are much calmer than they were in the previous scene. Notice how by the preservation of other humans prior to the attack, Mother Earth's wounds are healed and her clothing is repaired, but she remains still, because her remains haven't been processed, which is why the farmer nomads arrive on scene to do their part and help plant her in the ground to bring about the new cycle. Earthchild was also not killed like I said in the previous video, he was only knocked into a fit and likely fell unconscious, which is why he clings to her broken and confused, as his place in the world has now been changed because of her death, and he serves no true purpose without his other half. Let's talk about the farmers while we're at it. Like I said, their role in this world is to process and harvest the dead, and likely to help cultivate the seeds of life the Earthchild gives away. Their design is also slightly similar to the priests wearing robe-like garments, but with hoods that obscure their faces. To me, this design is likely reminiscent of the robes worn by Eastern Orthodox monks of the Great Schema rank. These monks have a very decorative shawl that normally ends with a skull at the bottom of these garments to represent the process of going from life to death to the ground. This is known as Adamah, which is the Hebrew word for ground or soil. You starting to pick up what I'm throwing down here? In the biblical Genesis, after God creates the earth, he creates Adam, the first man, from dust or clay, which these two things depend on which version of the Bible you read, by the way, and gives him the first soul of life from God's breath. If you're curious, this is why Adam is named Adam, because in Hebrew, the word Adam on its own simply means red, to reflect the color of raw, unfired clay. Adamah can roughly be translated to red ground and is analogous of Adam's life in the Bible. If you've been living under a rock this long into humankind, Adam and Eve's main punishment in Genesis after the original sin was to be mortal and to die. This is also why we use expressions like from dust or return to form if you're curious, as Adam, and by proxy all of mankind, is linked to the ground and farming. Boom, fucking mind blown, right? Let's be real, if I never listened to Batushka, I don't think I would have ever made these connections. You should listen to Batushka. It'll bring you closer to your babushka. So, to close up my super tinfoil hat theory, let's look at it this way. The farmers help keep the balance of the world by recycling the dead. If you're as nihilicious as me, this also plays off the concept that life exists to die and keep the cycle of life going as a whole. It's existential, yeah, but in all reality, that's just what nature is at the end of the day. Now in this scene, we see that Earthchild is clearly upset about the farmers taking his mom, but notice how this scene mirrors the scene where the priest took him away. It's either a great coincidence or a great callback. Also, this is kind of a stretched observation on my own part, but look at how the farmers walk at this point. They're not strained or hobbling like the other characters in the film. This was really just a note I took down when I did my initial note-taking for the film, but the more I thought about it, the more it kinda made sense to me, and I admit, if this sounds far-fetched, that's fine, but it's something worth thinking about coming up. If we put aside God, mother, and child, and only focus on the side characters that they interact with, notice how the first nomads we see, the priests, are walking with the assistance of one another's own movements and their tools. The next nomads we see are the mourners, who kinda throw a wrench into this observation, but we only see them hunched and kneeled for a matter of seconds, so it's hard to determine their overall movements. But they still have movement evocative of the priests to me, and we also see that one mourner in the front is dragging the other forward. Yet to me, they still look like their posture improves, as we can see them holding the stretcher up with some ease compared to how the priests had difficulty hoisting Earthchild around in a similar manner. The stick nomads we can see have some issues walking, but they're also shown at first walking on some rocky terrain, but their posture is also much more confident, straightened, and less reliant on one another. Finally, we come to the farmers, who have the most advanced form of movement in the film, with no real oddities to speak of. Jesus, I just described walking like a normal person advance. I think this movie fucking broke my brain. To me, this also shows a passage of time as humans in the world of Begotten evolve into more recognizable and less primitive people. Whether this was intentional or just the actors got tired of flailing around, I'm inclined to believe it was a deliberate artistic choice. Now, on to the last bits of the film. We see the farmers are carrying a pot, similar in design to the one shown earlier in the film with the priests, which also gives the audience something to focus on and question the contents of. The next shot of the slow pan over to a farmer is pretty clever because the rocks and stuff almost perfectly align to the costume design, and the film's lack of color makes the farmer look almost camouflaged if you still frame it just right. I'm gonna skip the nipple shot for YouTube's sake and move on to the water shot, which I feel is meant to evoke the idea that the dead are being processed, begins to help stimulate the natural cycle of the planet. It could also mean that the farmers are aware of the next flood in the area and they need to work quickly to add nutrients into the soil. After all, anyone who's studied basic world history should know that river flooding and nutrient dispersal is a huge part of our own history on Earth. You know, you paid attention in school, I assume, right? I don't need to explain the importance of this process, okay? Not gonna lie, man, I love the farmer outfit every time I see it because it really does blend in so well in the upcoming shots, and I can't praise it enough. I also like how this entire scene is just meant to evoke curiosity in the audience, and it gets more and more obvious as you keep watching, with the subtle hint of the knife tearing into the skin and the fly starting to become more and more audible. I'm also willing to bet money that the close-up shot of the skin tearing is meant to be analogous to God from the start of the film, tearing into himself to plant life. We also get a call back to the very opening of the film with the farmer clearly holding a bone in frame for quite a while. Life is flesh on bone, convulsing above the ground. Also, if the flies and stuff haven't clued you in yet, the camera also zooms in to show us a skull inside the pot near the farmers. I don't know exactly what the smash cuts are supposed to be. Part of me says they're close-ups of clouds, one part of me says it's meant to be corpses, and one part of me says it's meant to be an entity holding the sun in the final frame. I don't know, man. This is one thing I'm undecided on, and I'll let you argue about it. Yeah, that's right, I'm talking about you. You do the work, not me for once. Aside from the possible roll of toilet paper, I think the shot of the farmers carrying the pot away near the water is meant to also mirror the shot of the priest moving Earthchild earlier in the film. And this is such a cool shot, man, I can't help it. I love reflective camera work, and it always makes me a little giddy like a schoolgirl. Yeah, that kind. What does the hose represent? I'm not really sure, to be honest. I think it's just a carryover from the construction that was going on during the time of filming, and maybe Marriage thought it was a cool callback to Eraserhead. I don't know. Now we come to the wasteland scene, which I seriously have no idea how this was filmed. It's just cool to me, and I can't tell whether half of this was actually just nature or close-ups of the ground. I'm willing to say it's a bit of both, honestly, because the shot leading up to Earthchild is just wicked cool, and it reminds me of the ending of Dark Souls 3's DLC, The Ring City, where you can see a pygmy lord just crawling away from Gale. This is just so fucking cool, man. I really don't care how it was filmed. This whole scene to me is why I love that the film has no dialogue, because it conveys everything you need to know. This is a dangerous, hostile, inhospitable place. We don't see any natural life, just rocks, dirt, and decimation. It really just gives off this vibe of desolation, almost like from the overture at the start of the film. Intentional or not, It's just awesome and shows without any words that without Mother Earth, life on this planet is totally void. I also may not be alone in this, but I always get this kind of noble vibe from Earthchild here, like he's trying his damnedest to find Mother Earth against all the elements of the planet. It's just powerful, man, and we also finally see him worming along alone without the assistance of either his mother or the priest. He's just that determined and adamant whether or not he has a plan, and the actor who played him really does a good job of showing this, I feel. The scene of the farmers sacking Earthchild is also likely a mirror of when the priests helped and learned from him, and likely a dark irony of them killing him to use his body as fertilizer. Speaking of that, notice how when he's in the sack and they hit him, it appears that he's spitting out some of the flesh that he would have been giving to the priests? I did, because I have nothing better to do with my time, honestly. Now, why do I find that important to notice? Not only to get brownie points for noticing it, but because I think that with Earthchild's death and the expulsion of that flesh pod, that was likely the catalyst to help complete the recycling process and rebirth him and Mother Earth, just like how God used his flesh in the beginning to birth Mother Earth. Was it voluntary? Probably not, but it's just something I think makes sense in retrospect because I feel the flesh pods represent some aspect of life and knowledge, and it coming from a creator entity has to carry some merit. You know, you could ask me why I think this as well and how the pods were important this whole time. To be frank, Jack and Jill with you, I love Mesoamerican mythology, and one of the concepts that the flesh Earthchild leaves behind reminds me of Totec from Aztec cultures. Totec was a god of a few different aspects, but mainly rebirth in agriculture, with his main depiction being a man covered in flayed skin. The skin was meant to be analogous to plant life growing on the earth, but also to be a literal depiction of death on top of life. Now, do I think marriage intended this very specific Aztec deity to be analogous to some gore that comes out of a dude's mouth? I don't know, man, it's possible, but to me, it's what it reminds me of, and the farmers being, farmers, it just kind of clicks to me, but that's just my interpretation because Totec was a god associated to rebirth, and the quote from the start, life is flesh on bone, convulsing above the ground, and, the movie deals with the themes associated to cycles of life and death. I can't be that crazy, right?
What is that? What the fuck is that?
Also, why do I think the farmers kill Earthchild now, rather than earlier when they had the chance? It could be because the farmers knew that Mother Earth needed to be processed first to avoid some sort of cataclysmic event. Remember, I'm going off the assumption that Earthchild and Mother Earth instilled into the nomads the concept of recycling and processing the dead, so they likely knew better. They don't seem to kill him out of sadism either, it actually looks pretty controlled and merciful. I'm going to just jump ahead past the next shot of the farmers because it's really just more of the same shots from earlier but with fly sounds, and cut to the storm breaking. I love this, just because I love rainstorms in real life, so a little bit of bias here. I feel with Earthchild's death coupled with Mother Earth's death, this triggers the world to storm since nature is out of whack and attempting to readjust itself and attempting to rebirth the two. Notice how when we cut back to the farmers planting, we also hear more water and nature sounds. Pretty cool, I think, compared to the earlier rumbling drone and fly sounds. We also get a nice up-close shot of the flesh of the dead being planted to show what's actually going on in this scene, so that's nice. The shots of the sticks pushing the flesh in could also be a mirror to the stick nomads using their tools to destroy and ravage, which is a nice touch, but I think it might have been incidental. Finally, we're at the home stretch, baby. We get the cool, happy music, plants growing, and then the footage of Mother Earth and Child being reunited in the forest. This is probably one of the more overt and obvious parts of the movie, but it just shows that this is what the farmers were doing, helping balance things out through their knowledge and compassion for the world. It's a pretty heavy-handed and basic metaphor, really, that I think most people can figure out. Begotten contains a very strong message of recycling to help keep our own planet alive and what the dangers of harming the environment can be. Just, a little bit more graphic. We also get a shot of the skull in the ground, which I think is meant to convey the real concept that the ground we walk on contains millions of years of life and death just under our feet, and eventually we'll be part of that collective for the future. What does the arm guy mean? I'm not really sure because I think it just illustrates the same point above, really. Maybe it was meant to be a pareidolia trick where our brain just sees a face and arm in the dirt and it's not actually a proper actor? I don't know, it's clever regardless, and I like it more than the skull if I'm honest. And finally, the forest shot. I think this is just meant to show what the world is. Life and death, constantly, and that this whole event in the movie will play out again in some way or the other. A present that never stops passing. And that's the movie. So, when people say that a film like this is just a bunch of random bullshit slapped into a camera and smacked onto a screen, you can see that people like me with an analytical mind find that idea, how do the kids say it these days? Fucky. I think as much as I don't honestly like Begotten as a film, it does have a very compelling and interesting vibe that makes you intrigued to want to know what the hell it's all about. Marriage and his crew really did make something worth talking about, and if I had the same skills and ideas I have today and saw this back on release, man, you bet your ass I'd be formulating a deep dive just like this pronto, because there's a lot of meat to chew on here for someone like me. You know, one of the most common things I've told people about Begotten as I've been working on this project is, it's a film that's not ultimately that interesting to watch, but infinitely more exciting to talk about, and I think that's really fair. I obviously hold the same feelings for works like Silent Hill 2 because, yeah, the game itself is absolutely uninteresting on a gameplay level, but 100 times more exciting to dissect and analyze because it was designed that way. Something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you know, the only one that exists, it's a much more visceral experience that you don't need to analyze too much to get the context and message behind. Yeah, there's some subtle jabs at capitalism, themes regarding animal cruelty, and a vibe of unbridled human depravity in remote areas, but you can just, watch it and, look at it with your own eyeballs and get the general idea that it's not just a movie about a guy running around with a chainsaw. Begotten straddles that fine line of being so obtuse that it feels like you're grasping at straws for answer, but also pretty lenient in showing you the themes. I mean, the most common boring thing I see people say is, it's a direct metaphor for the God is dead quote. You're not wrong, but it feels a little disingenuous to just call it at that or say, it's a movie about nature. As I've discussed in great detail, I might add, I think those points are valid and that's fine to stop at the surface level, but there's so many small things in this film that really tickled my brain on repeat watches, like the water shot of the priests and farmers, or not noticing the clock on the intro scene until my second time watching the film. So much of this film seems like a total mess, but at the same time like it's controlled and deliberate and not incidental, and it's funny because one of the people I know in real life that watched the film said, it was really shocking and horrific, but it wasn't enough to make me stop watching, and I can't explain why. Ordinarily, if a movie isn't interesting, you can just turn it the fuck off and play RuneScape or something because something isn't clicking with you and you just don't care enough. I mean, when I was a teenager, I went and saw Green Hornet, yeah, that one, in theaters with a girl, and we were the only people in the theater, save for another couple at the top, that were playing an intense game of baseball throughout the film. I recall there was a fight scene at a construction zone, and I turned to the girl and just said, "This is a bad movie. I'm sorry." And she just sort of nodded. We put our feet up together on the empty seats and just sort of laughed because, we both knew it wasn't very good and it kind of checked out at that point. Same thing with me and a friend playing Minecraft on an Xbox One day because they got it from someone at work and we were curious to see how it actually was. We both were playing for about a half an hour, looked at each other, and my friend goes, "You want to play the real version because this is kind of shit." And we did, because it was indeed kind of shit. Begotten was like that for me. I could have easily just turned it off, never looked at it again, and never made this whole thing, but I didn't. I wasn't impressed or blown away. I felt kind of dirty, like I was watching a snuff film if I'm honest, but the part of me that knows this is R went and said, "Come on, Seth, you know what's up. This is right up your alley," and, well, here we are. I knew this wasn't just a movie about nothing or random bullshit, and to be fair, from the previous video, it shows, because yes, I think if you watched this movie and just said, "It's boring," you were watching the movie wrong. I really hate when people say you did X wrong, therefore you didn't get Y, but there really is a case for stuff like that, especially in regards to outside or fringe art. Everything has a reason and a message, and art is no exception because let's face it, you don't hold a McDonald's apple pie in the same regard as a homemade apple pie, right? They're both the same item, but you would judge them in totally different brackets. The McDonald's pie is cheap, frozen, and not really all that great, but it gets the job done and it's comforting. Using a recipe your babushka taught you, it's a little bit more work, not that much more expensive, and it takes effort, but the effort is worth it. It's nostalgic, and you feel a sense of accomplishment after you're done eating it. Yet, at the end of the day, it's just pie, which is ultimately just empty calories and a luxury. A film like Begotten has to be analyzed, questioned, and looked into to get the proper experience. You don't just watch it like a fucking Marvel movie and forget about it after the hype dies off and the next film is shot out onto the assembly line. I'll admit though, Begotten is still not as palatable as something like Eraserhead, which is a little bit more beginner-friendly to avant-garde cinema, and actually a better film in my mind. Both are good films, by the way. They're both stylistic and entrenched in symbolism, but Begotten does make you work for the answers a bit better, which to some, they may like it more. It's really up to personal taste and opinions at the end of the day. And you know, I can't say that this film isn't important because, well, in the next video I'll discuss the overall impact on me, so I'll see you then.